When you think Ducati, you probably think exotic, beautiful, sport-oriented Italian motorcycles. There's an aura around Ducati that no other manufacturer has, but here's the thing, it wasn't always this way, and in many ways, it all starts with the motorcycle we're looking at today, a motorcycle that for many is the most beautiful motorcycle ever created, the iconic 916. By the mid-1980s, Ducati was facing an uphill battle. Despite gaining traction in racing, the company just didn't have real-world prestige as a sport bike manufacturer, and they weren't selling enough bikes to fund their racing program. After Cagiva and the Castiglione brothers purchased Ducati, they began pursuing a more modern power plant for their motorcycles. Now, I have to mention Ian Falloon's amazing book on the Ducati 916, and honestly, all of his books. Ian Falloon is one of the great modern authors writing about motorcycles. I'm indebted to him for so many of his great, really readable books. So I'll put a link to his book on the 916 in the description below if you guys want to check it out. Now, he rightly points out that though the roots of the 916's development could technically go all the way back to the very beginning of Ducati's production and racing history, it really started at this point in 1986 when Ducati created their first 4-valve Desmo Quattro twin. Now, this new 4-valve twin was a massive departure from their previous engines. It was now liquid-cooled, fuel injected, and they finally had a base on which to build their future motorcycles. Fast forward a few years and a few World Superbike titles, ongoing changes in World Superbike racing rules would allow Ducati to make an all-new, bigger, lighter motorcycle for racing, but also for production. Built on the evolution of the Desmo Quattro engine, but now with an all-new chassis, and the result would be Ducati's most iconic and beautiful production sport bike of all time. Now, the engine was mostly unchanged from its predecessor, the 888, but Ducati had a few tricks up their sleeve to get more power. A completely different kind of airbox was essential to getting the most out of the increase in capacity. Previous Ducati airboxes were basically plastic units that were separate from the structure of the bike that sort of sat under the gas tank. Before the 916, a larger, integrated, molded airbox connected directly to the frame and then also contoured to the bottom of the fuel tank made it so that they could just get more air and fuel into the engine for combustion. These and other slight differences meant that the bike was up about 4 horsepower over the previous 888, and more importantly, as we'll see, it was just significantly more aerodynamic, better balanced, compact, and also a bit lighter. But still, what's really significant about the 916 was everything else around the bike, and that's really what we remember this motorcycle for. At this point, Italian designer Massimo Tamburini, the mind behind the radical Passo 750, and one of the founders of Bimota, well, he was heading up Cagiva's new design studio at this point. It's important to note that designers like Tamburini, they're not just stylists. This is a person who understands the entire motorcycle and was able to build not just beautiful motorcycles, but also geometrically sound, complete packages capable of winning on the track. This is somebody who could design an entire motorcycle aside from the internals of the engine, frame the whole thing. And it worked out great for Tamburini because this new design studio was located conveniently in his hometown of Rimini, and this worked out well as it would turn out the 916 would take him about 6 years to design. Tamburini and a small team of engineers began mapping out the new motorcycle in 1988. The team would grow over time as this project continued to present various problems. One aspect that took the longest was the frame. Up to this point, Tamburini was comfortable with traditional tubular steel frames, so that's what they did instead of, at this point, the more modern Delta box frame. But the overall bike needed to have a smaller wheelbase than the previous 888, coupled with the larger engine and the goal of a 50-50 weight distribution. This made for quite a challenge for Tamburini in designing this motorcycle. But the result, after years of work, was an incredibly compact, powerful motorcycle. Tamburini really focused on giving the 916 improved aerodynamics over Ducati's previous models, and the result was a unique form, really unlike pretty much anything out there. The front end was much smaller than your typical sport bike at this time, and the motorcycle as a whole was smooth and curvaceous. Tamburini even admitted that, especially from the top down, the 916 was meant to mimic the female form. Of course, Tamburini wasn't the first designer to consider this, and he certainly wasn't the last. He just might have been the first to admit it. Aside from World Superbike, the 916 was designed in part with the goal of winning in endurance racing, and this is the primary reason the 916 featured a single-sided swing arm, because it's much easier to change the wheel. It's really that simple. Of course, Ducati was not the first company to use this setup, but the 916 would go down as probably the most famous single-sided swing arm and would change the trajectory of Ducati design forever. Even if their next big model would have a traditional swing arm, they would go right back to this design setup because it really became almost synonymous with Ducati. And all of that started with the 916. And the swing arm for this bike was really good. It wasn't just there to be pretty. It was actually 50% more torsionally rigid than the previous 888's double-sided swing arm. Now, what makes the 916 design stand out from its sport bike peers is really its coherence and its slim, beautiful, curvy package. From the small fairing with its unique oblong headlights to the specially designed 3-spoke wheels, the 2x2 underswept exhaust, to just the overall aggressive forward stance of the bike. Nothing else really quite looked like this. But Ducati design would follow this forever. Now, I say that nothing else looked like this, when in reality, right within Ducati's recent history, there is a rarely mentioned special race bike that has to be mentioned because, in my opinion, there's no possible way to deny its influence on the 916. This is the Ducati Supermono, a single-cylinder race bike made for racing. Now, a quick Google will tell you that this bike came out after the 916, and that's true, but the prototype was actually unveiled over a year before the 916, and its bodywork was designed by Pierre Terblanche, the guy who would go on to make the ever-hated successor to the 916, which is the 999, which looked absolutely nothing like the 916 or the Supermono. Terblanche had a sort of distaste for the 916, and he would give all sorts of reasons why in talking about the 999, but I can't help but wonder if he wasn't a bit frustrated with Tamburini being consistently praised for the way the 916 looked, when maybe he was a bit perturbed that his Supermono design, though also praised for its beauty, was rarely mentioned as an influence on the 916. Now, we know that the 916 was developed for some 6 years, and though the Supermono prototype was unveiled before the 916, the question is, which came first? Terblanche worked with Tamburini and has talked about what Tamburini was like. They just approached motorcycle design very different. Terblanche designed the bodywork for the Supermono in just a few months before the Supermono's unveil in '92, and a 1992 drawing of the 916 looks similar to the end product, but not exactly the same, so I think it's fair to say that the designs probably influenced each other, but I just really think it would be crazy to say that Terblanche's design didn't at least have some influence on the 916. I mean, for example, I just praised the 916's wheels. Look at the Supermono's wheels. Now, I don't think this takes anything away from Tamburini. I do just believe that Terblanche should be owed his dues for his incredible designs that he has done for Ducati, which we'll talk about another one in a later video. Now, at the 1993 Milan show, the 916 was finally unveiled to almost universal acclaim. This was kind of like a cultural moment where Ducati was really coming into its own. You know, there is no Ducati as we think of them today without this moment. Ducati's entire reputation would flow out of this unveil. The 916 was a picture of their former pursuits in, making the absolute best, most technologically advanced and fastest motorcycles in the world. But now there would be this future focus that would become clear in making bikes that were beautiful and desirable and exotic and unique. And also making motorcycles that set your butt on fire and maybe weren't all that comfortable, but hey, they looked really good. Now, in a video celebrating the most beautiful motorcycle ever made, I do feel bad pointing out some of its faults. But here's the thing. The faults that the 916 had are the direct result of its overall form. It looked a certain way to make it better, but it also couldn't look the way that it did without some of these problems. And that's, of course, the reason the successor, the 999, would be both significantly more functional and also significantly more ugly. Despite performing well for Ducati in racing, as a street bike, owners found the 916 to be, I guess difficult is the best word. The spring-loaded side stand had never been a good idea, but, it was required at this time in certain countries. The bike was prone to overheating and just giving off a ton of heat. If you're pretty much anywhere but hauling it through the twisties or out on the highway, the bike gets really hot. More than anything though, the stance of the bike is just so aggressive. It makes it so that riding a 916 for long periods of time would just be uncomfortable on your back and your wrists. So, the stop and go traffic is a time to give your body a break, but then the bike just starts cooking you. On top of this, many experienced electrical problems with their 916s. Ongoing maintenance was more regular and also more expensive. It pretty much was just an Italian machine. In all reality, the 916 was like living with a true race bike. And I think most owners knew that going into it, and they were happy with that as being part of the experience. None of its faults, though, could stop the 916 from selling and becoming kind of an international icon. Even if it took Ducati quite a bit more time than expected to actually make production models, it did extremely well for the company, and like I said, it really propelled Ducati to the world stage in a way that no model had before it. A 1997 Cycle World Review pinned the 916 against a few new Japanese twins made to compete against it, and the bike in production form ran the fastest lap ever recorded at that time at Willow Springs in California, and so through most of its life, the 916 was basically the most desirable sport bike that money could buy, though it remained virtually unchanged through its lifetime. If you can admit the 916's beauty, what is it that makes it so beautiful and for its time so unique? For this video, I spent entirely too much time comparing this bike with its peers, from the likes of Honda and Suzuki and Kawasaki. The first and most obvious difference is the simplicity and just lessness, if that's a word. A Fireblade or GSXR or especially a Ninja with their wonderful 90s paint schemes, they're just so much more bulky and busy in terms of design. They look more like what we would now call sport touring bikes, while the 916 looked like a proper race bike. While the Japanese sport bikes had lots of different color schemes and materials and boxy frames, the 916 stood there with its beautiful single shade of red, curvy lines, smaller and sleeker bodywork, and even beautiful exposed tubular frame, as well as the flowing, concealed, underswept exhaust. At every level, it just kind of screams less is more, and in this way, its influence on sport bike design going forward can't be overstated. But perhaps even more, it's the way the bike and its individual parts work together to make something that is really cohesive, that would really stand out among other motorcycles. In many ways, sport bikes were going through some growing pains at this time in terms of design. It wasn't that many years prior to this that a sport bike was really just a traditional, what we would now call standard motorcycle, just with a bigger, faster engine. The peak of that being the late 70s and early 80s with motorcycles like the CBX. It was much easier to make a motorcycle's design coherent at that time when there was just less stuff, and also without bodywork. So something like a Triumph Bonneville of the 60s or say a Honda CB from the 70s, they were coherent and beautiful and simple because there was just so much less going on, and so everything could kind of fit together in a nice way. But as manufacturers started adding bodywork and as bikes became more tech heavy with just more individual parts, making a simple, minimalistic design just became more difficult for sport bike designers. And in my opinion, Tamburini and the Ducati 916 really paved the way for making sport bike designs beautiful. It's often touted as the most beautiful motorcycle of its time, and maybe that's true, maybe it isn't. I think for me, it's just the first truly beautiful sport bike. It's the first of a kind. Tamburini knew that the greatest automotive designs for both cars and motorcycles have always been the simplest, and he knew that if there was ever a way to make that work for a sport bike, that it would change everything. Now, I know many of you will disagree. Of course, there are lots of awesome sport bike designs prior to the 916, the original GSXR 750 and Katana. But for me, beautiful isn't really the word that comes to mind when I think of those motorcycles in the same way that it does with the 916. Now, I would love to hear your guys' thoughts on all of this. Do you think that the 916 deserves that title of most beautiful motorcycle of all time, or is it a different motorcycle? Thanks for watching, guys, and we'll see you in the next video. Ride safe.